Thank you, everybody, for coming. I'll be talking about Mechanicsburg, as you probably guessed by this time. Mechanicsburg was chartered as a borough in 1828. However, its story starts much earlier than that. Can everybody hear me all right? Okay. It was developed along the two parallel roads that were important to the westward movement in Pennsylvania. These roads were these roads connected the two major ferries of the Susquehanna, the Harris Ferry and the Simpson Ferry. The old Trindle Road, named after an early settler, John Trindle, was one path from the Harris Ferry. And Simpson Street, also known as Simpson Ferry Road, oddly enough, was the connection for the Simpson Ferry, which actually was down near New Cumberland. The Simpson Ferry was owned by General Michael T. Simpson, and John Harris was the one who began the Harris Ferry. The location of Mechanicsburg was really very appropriate because it was approximately 10 miles from Harrisburg and 10 miles from Carlisle. So it was right in the middle of the point when it was usually only that amount, 10 miles, could be traveled in one day's time, particularly if you had wagons or livestock or whatever. Okay, so it was a very good point for a stop in Mechanicsburg. There were a few taverns in the area where they could stay overnight, and most importantly, there were mechanics that could make repairs to those wagons and their wagon wheels and anything else that was necessary. It was this small population of mechanics is how gave the town its name. These mechanics evolved into a number of wagon, spoke, hub, wheel companies that prospered in Mechanicsburg for well into the 1900s. Mechanicsburg has many buildings, which you're going to see some of them today in the borough, that played a significant role in creating our history. The most intriguing element of these buildings are the people that made them, and made them their homes and their livelihood. They illustrate not just the history of brick and mortar, but a saga of a town and its families, which weave an interesting and curious web of relationships. The first photo we have is of John Coover's house. And John Coover, in my opinion, is one of the founding fathers of Mechanicsburg. He's responsible for not only this house, but many others we're going to talk about today. This began with this house, with his family and his general store resided at 74 West Main Street. He was not the original owner, however. That was Jacob Kraut, who built a log house in the first decade of the 1800s. By 1810, though, Kraut had sold the building to George Snyder, who was also a carpenter, and replaced Kraut's house with a larger one. In 1814, when John Coover purchased the property, it remained in his direct family hands until the 1890s. Originally, the house was a two-story log house, and then a one-story log business office was added, and the next, which you can't really see right now, is at the back, a brick addition was added. And finally, a second-story addition was added to the office. From 1890 and 1975, the house had at least 6 owners until Robert and Betty Meyer bought the home. Robert Meyer was the publisher of the magazine Early American Life, and he returned the home to its early appearance in 1976. This house was only the beginning, however, of John Coover's legacy. The next house, am I supposed to do that?
Yeah. Yep, you moved too far, maybe.
I went too far.
Get back.
There we go. The next house he built around 1835 was at 70 West Main Street. This house was given to his daughter Elizabeth when she married Levi Kauffman. And this house even had on this left side here an adjoining entrance to the 74 West Main Street that we just talked about. Levi Kauffman started a drug and hardware business at the northwest corner of Frederick and West Main Street. And if you're familiar with it, that would be right across the street from the first house we looked at. That hardware store, he started in 1854, and that hardware business had many owners throughout the years, including William Kiefer. You may have heard of that name. The last owner was Melton Weber, and he closed the store in 1999. So that building was on the site as a hardware store for 145 years. There's not many businesses who say that. Levi was also a cashier for the Second National Bank and also started a fire insurance business, so he was a very busy man. At various times in his life, he was also a Burgess of Mechanicsburg, a councilman, a school director, and one of the board members of Irving College. In 1902, this home was bought by Robert Thomas Jr., who was the editor of the publisher of the local newspaper, the Daily Journal. This home remained in the Thomas family until 1986, when Mary Thomas and her husband George sold it to Janet Breckville. Mary had been a direct descendant of Elizabeth Kauffman, for whom the house was originally built. Long-standing family names that continued to have the homes here. Next one. Around 1850, John Coover built this house at 64 West Main for his daughter Sarah when she married Ephraim Zook. Ephraim was a merchant of sawed and planed lumber. He owned what was been described at the time as a steam merchant mill. That's not a term I'm usually familiar with. I don't know if you've heard it before or not. It was built at Frederick and Allen Streets. He sold that factory in 1857 to Moses Eberly, who established the Eberly and Sons lumber mill. Ephraim died in 1862, the same year that Sarah's father, John Coover, had died. She later married in 1869 William Oswald. William ran a coal yard, but in 1879 he was listed also as a teller of the Second National Bank. William died in 1884 and Sarah in 1912, at which time this house passed on to her two sons, Harry and Charles Zook. In 1914, they sold this house to James L. Young, who had been a Mechanicsburg attorney. At his death in 1955, the house was sold to Adora Richwine, and at some point the house was transformed into apartments. And just a little aside, Dora Richwine happens to be one of my ancestors. She died in an apartment on the second floor, which I found out many years later, and I had actually lived there for about a year of my life. So, another daughter, Susan, married Dr. Philip Long, and they resided at 1 East Main Street. Nope. Oh, okay. I don't have that. Okay. 1 East Main Street. This house was also owned by John Coover. His name keeps coming up. It was originally built in the 1830s and was a three-bay, two-story brick house, and it had Italian features. The third story and the modern windows were added in 1858, and Dr. Philip Long, who was a doctor and a pharmacist, bought the property from John Cooper in 1849 for only $1,100. And I don't know if how many of you are familiar with it. It's where Jimmy's hot dog place used to be. Right now it's vacant. Oh, well, it's been now taken over by Titan Roofing. John Cooper also held a number of community positions, such as the borough councilman, and he was the secretary and treasurer of the Union Church for a number of years. But he also accumulated 160 acres of land south of Simpson Street, extending from York Street on the west to Shepherdstown Road on the east, by the time of his death in 1862. At his death, his property was left to his daughters. He did have 4 daughters and 1 son, but the son did not live to maturity. These women and her husbands went through the process of laying out the lots and selling them. In addition to the land south of Simpson, he also owned land, according to the 1867 map of Mechanicsburg, north of Factory Street. The names of Long, Kauffman, Zook, and Oswald were on a multitude of deeds for Mechanicsburg. Land including the land that became the Cedar Hill Cemetery, which was located at West and West Main Street in the 19th century. And around 1940s, by that time, the cemetery had been totally abolished, and actually a house was built there. Adam Regal, now we'll go to the next one. Adam Regal and John Coover were partners. When John Coover bought that house at 74 West Main, where we started, Adam was also living there with him and running the store with him. Adam Regal's son, John, was actually born in this house, in the 74 West Main Street house, in 1818. But after they split their partnership, Adam continued as a merchant in this house at 2-6 originally, West Main Street. His son John took over the family business when Adam died in 1851. It was originally built in 1840 with 5 bays. You can just see the 5 there. In 1867, John retired, but he continued to own the property. And by this time, the 3 eastern bays, which are to the right, had become the Second National Bank. And the remaining 2 on the left became John's house residence, and also John's brother Levi Regal had his shoe and leather shop there. And you can see, see if I get the thing. Yeah, right here, those things are shoes and leather goods that are hanging in the picture. The building has gone through many alterations through the fall, and you can see this through the next series of pictures. This one of the bank was taken around 1903. So you can see there is electricity, there's street lights. This one is in 1910, quite a renovation from the prior one. And this one is in the 1940s. By this time, you can see that the 2 bays that originally was on the left has been destroyed and another building has been built. And the structure, though, the bank, is still there, and is still there today. It was a Citizens Bank today. All right. Another interesting connection to Adam Regal's family is the station master's house on West Strawberry Alley. Adam's daughter, Mary, married George Zacharias, who was the first station master, and his family, including his son Frank and his daughter Gertrude, lived in this house. The house was built by the Cumberland Valley Railroad in 1866. George was also responsible for the passenger station, which was built next door in 1867. Now, another home that has a very interesting history is 39 West Main Street. Originally built in the 1850s as a 3-bay, 2-story brick house, in 1874, the home was sold to Alexander Underwood for the price of $7,000. And in 1874, that was quite high. Alexander actually was one of the wealthiest residents of Mechanicsburg at that time. He had a remarkable background before he retired in Mechanicsburg in 1871. He started out as a saddle and harness maker, and he switched back and forth between that trade and farming for a number of years. In 1868, he purchased 215 acres in York County that became the Mount Hope Magnet Ore Mine. In addition to the mine, he also, and his home here at 39 West Main, he also owned a 2-story frame house and store on West Main, near High Street, a 2-story brick house on East Main, near Irving College, and 3 lots on the corner of South Market and Koller Street. But that wasn't all he owned. He also owned large land holdings out of the state, such as a 240-acre farm in Russell County, Kansas, and 640 acres in Iowa County, Iowa. When he died in 1893, his estate inventory, not including the property, was assessed at $34,000. His wife Matilda died in 1902, and at that time the property was sold to William Penn Lloyd, who was another local Mechanicsburg attorney. During his ownership of the two-story building, a two-story, I'm not sure you can see it there, two-story projecting bay was built on the west facade. Yeah, you can't see that at all on this side. And a third story was added. Also at that time, an unusual second-story angular bay was put on the east side of the building. In 1951, William L. Sunday, another attorney and great-grandson of William Floyd, purchased the property for his law firm, and he made extensive renovations and made the second story of the building into a very spacious two-bedroom apartment. In 1858, George Hummel built this house at 312 East Main Street. He was a burgess of Mechanicsburg during the Confederate invasion in June of 1863. General Jenkins came to this door to see George and Sarah Hummel to demand the town flag. And the legend has it that Sarah actually stood behind the door with a gun while George gave over the flag. When given the flag, the Confederate soldier put the flag under the rear of his saddle. And there has been a lot of legends speaking about that, but just in the last year or so, the Mechanicsburg Museum received a number of Civil War letters from a Mechanicsburg soldier. And it actually is documented in those letters that that did occur. They did put it under there. The father had wrote that to the son, and then the son had repeated it back to him when they were, conversing in the correspondence. In addition to being the burgess, Mr. Hummel also had a grain and coal business at 14 North Walnut Street. He established that business in 1856, and in 1880s, D.J. Butzel, which is name on there, bought the business. In the 1950s, they were still selling feed and eggs in this building. Today, that warehouse is now the offices of Walker Realty. The Hummel's three maiden daughters had the house at 230 East Main Street built as a memorial to their parents, and also as the parsonage for the Trinity Lutheran Church in 1896. It continued as a parsonage for 73 years. This is the church, Trinity Lutheran Church, which was built in 1858. It's only one block west of the parsonage, and this is at 132 East Main Street. The steeple shown here was removed in 1908, and the current one was installed in 1987. So it looks, the top at least looks slightly different than it is there now. The earliest record of this property at 36 East Main Street, and it's a property here that's all decorated. That's what I'm talking about. 36 West Main Street. It was rather peculiar mention that Anna V. Koller purchased that lot by an act of the Pennsylvania legislature. And I've never been able to figure out why, but that's how it was documented. The lot was later sold to Levi Snell, who built the house around 1857. The photo here shows the house when it was owned by the Eckels and during the 1907 centennial celebration. This house in 1874 was sold for $7,500 to Dr. M.B. Musser and his wife, Rebecca Rupp. They moved to the house in 1875. Mr. Musser also owned this pharmacy at 11 West Main Street, so he had a very short walk to work, which later became the Brunhouse drugstore and later, more in our time, the Daniel Pharmacy. After the death of Dr. Musser and his wife, the house was sold for $6,000 to Eliza Bricker, and shortly thereafter, it was sold to William Eckels, who was a Coover, and he transferred the property to his two sons, George Morris Eckels and Walter L. Eckels. George was actually a doctor, William was a pharmacist. And they operated a drugstore just east of Franklin Hall. That was the large building at the corner of the square, before moving to the 36 West Main Street. This is the interior of the Eckels Pharmacy. Here is about they actually opened the pharmacy in 1879, and local newspaper accounts said they installed telephones in June of 1884, and a fine new soda fountain was added in April 1900. That's my favorite part. This photo shows the interior with Maybelle, the young girl here that's standing on the stool, was George's young daughter, and on the left there. And this is 1908. The store interior was expanded, and they created a storefront more like you see today. The large plate glass store windows, the decorative stained glass windows at the top, and the brownstone building, the steps to the building. George died in 1917, leaving the house to his widow, Clara, and Clara transferred the property to their daughter, Maybelle, who ended up being a pharmacist as well, and she continued the operation as a pharmacist. The interior of the soda fountain remains very similar to the 1925 renovations that Maybelle made, and many, if you go in there today, will see many of the 1929 furnishings. And today it still is an ice cream parlor, and there's a pharmacy museum in the back of the store. This building also had its heyday in the movies. This being the site of the Columbia Pictures film Girl Interrupted in 1999. Although, like I said, no longer a pharmacy, it still is active today as an ice cream parlor, and I am a frequent patron of that ice cream parlor. Okay, there we go. This double house at 301 and 303 East Main Street, it's at the corner of East Main and Walnut, was built in 1887. James B. Koller and his wife Dora and their family lived in the half that was 301, that would be to your left, from 1898 through 1925. William Koller, James' brother, lived in the part that was 303. James owned the J.B. Koller Company, which made spokes, rims, hubs, and wheels. The business was established in the 1890s. Those mechanics are still working in Mechanicsburg. And originally his brother Jacob was a partner. In 1908, Jacob sold his share to his brother William. And then the company eventually did close sometime between 1914 and 1919. This house, that's the factory he had around the 1890s. And this was on Allen Street. None of this is there now. This house is at 325 East Main Street and was built around 1844 by Benjamin Beverley. In 1855, Benjamin and his wife Barbara transferred the 58 acres and the house to their daughter Elizabeth and her future husband, Solomon Perry Gorgas. They were married in that house and they remained there the rest of their lives. Solomon Gorgas was a leader in the community at the time, and he was one of the founders of the First National Bank. The home remained in the family until 1969. This house, at 401 East Main Street, was built in the 1880s by Solomon for his daughter Anna, possibly as a wedding gift. This house originally had a tower in the center, but it was removed in approximately 1920s. Okay. All right, we're back to the Kollers. Anna B. Gorgas married Jacob Koller, who had the grain and coal business on North Walnut Street. Originally, this building was built in the 1840s by Thomas Bryson for grain that he produced at his grist mill. During the Civil War, this warehouse was used as a hospital by the Confederates, and guess what? They used all that grain to feed their horses. The Bryson family operated the business until the 1890s, when A.B. Harnish bought the business. Koller bought the business in the early 1900s and was still operating in 1936. Currently, this building is the Simpson Public Library.
Oh, yeah.
At their death, Jacob and Anna's daughter, Mary, inherited the house. The house was then passed on, I guess let's go back to the other house. There, the house was passed on to Mary's daughter, Marjorie, and for 105 years, that house remained in the family, being passed on from daughter to daughter. The home now continues to be a private residence. There we go. Irving College was founded in 1856 by Solomon Gorgas. The first building erected was this Irving Hall, which is the one you see there, approximately about 1860. In addition to the classrooms, the college president and the students also resided in that building. The college was the 5th women's college to be chartered in the United States, and it was one of the first to offer degrees in arts and science. Except for a very brief time in the 1880s, the college continued to conduct classes until 1929, when it closed its doors. But by that time, it had graduated 874 women during its 73-year period. The campus originally spread out over 8 acres, but only 2 buildings remain today. This one, Irving, and if you could, I don't have a picture of that. To the right of that would have been Columbia Hall. This building, oddly enough, is one of my favorites. The building at 100 and 102 East Locust Street has a real amazing history, and that is why one is my favorite. In 1831, the trustees of the Methodist Episcopal Church purchased this lot for the purpose of erecting a house of worship. The sanctuary they built the house and built the church, in 1834, and it was also used as the first public school in Mechanicsburg. I've been told it was in the basement, is where the school was held. The sanctuary of the church was also used as a town hall for plays and dances for the entertainment of the community. In 1854, however, the church population had grown so much that they needed another building. So another group of trustees sold this church and built a church that stood on the southwest corner of the square. This church was torn down after a hurricane destroyed it in, I believe, the 1950s. And a new church was built on Simpson Street, and that was the Wesley Methodist Church. The Locust Street property here was then purchased by John Phillips and Samuel King, who opened a window sash business there. And there was a large opening was made on the west side. We've been somewhere over here. To allow trucks to go in, to go inside the building to pick up merchandise. Phillips and King used the old church bell that was left behind to serve as the town clock, and it rang at regular intervals, so everybody knew where they were supposed to be at what time. Samuel King was a soldier in the Civil War, and when he retired in 1865, he was a major. He resumed his business and transferred the building to his wife Elizabeth after he bought the shares from John Phillips. King died in 1892, and when his wife Elizabeth died in 1905, their son Harry King sold his share of the property to his brother William Wallace King. William was a millwright, and he made considerable changes to the house. This is when it actually became a house. Actually, it became a double house. I'm not sure you can see it, but it is a double house right now. He lived on one side and rented the other side. He lived there until his death in 1930, and he left his estate to his wife, Edith. Before her death, Edith transferred the property to her daughter, Romaine Lance, and her husband, Benjamin. The Lance family lived there with Edith until her death. The family continued to rent the east side of the double house, and in 1971, when Benjamin Lance died, and in 1976, when Romaine died, they passed the house to their niece, Edith Bear. Mr. and Mrs. Bear resided in the house for a number of years, but what's really important is in 1985, they were awarded a Certificate of Excellence in preservation from the Landmarks and Preservation Committee of Mechanicsburg. Now this photo actually was taken after their renovation, but not recently. If you see the house now, it doesn't look quite this well. It has deteriorated through the years, and that's really a shame because, as I just demonstrated to you, this little stucco house illustrates a really long and varied history in Mechanicsburg. Having been first a church and a temporary school, then a window sash factory, an improvised town hall, a double family home, and now it's apartments. So it's a really shame to have seen it deteriorate over the years. And that's kind of why it's my favorite. I like to be able to fix it up. Okay. This talk is giving you just a small sample of the history of Mechanicsburg as seen through its people and its buildings and the relationships they made together. Thank you for coming.